6:15 in the morning. The Philippine Sea, 300 miles east of the Luzon Strait. USS Carl Vinson was already turning hard to starboard when the first hypersonic signature flared on the long-range infrared sensors of the strike group. There was no time for a standard intercept, and no time for the escorting destroyers to launch a full defensive screen against a weapon moving at this velocity. The humid morning air around the carrier was thick with the scent of jet fuel and the salt spray of the Pacific. Deep in the sky, a DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle had just transitioned into its terminal dive, moving at more than 5 times the speed of sound. The strike was not a single explosion, but a kinetic nightmare of compressed air and molten metal. The DF-17 missile punched through the 4.5-inch steel of the flight deck just aft of the No. 4 catapult. The sound was not a bang, but a sustained, bone-rattling roar that vibrated through the entire 100,000 tons of the ship's displacement. A fireball, fueled by the missile's remaining propellant and the high-octane aviation fuel in the lines below the deck, erupted into a massive column. Black smoke and orange flame rose 300 feet into the air, visible to every ship in the carrier strike group. The impact zone, located at coordinates 18 degrees 40 minutes north, 125 degrees 10 minutes east, was transformed into a landscape of jagged steel. 2 FA-18 fighter jets, parked in the Spot 4 position, were caught in the Beckett initial blast wave and tossed across the deck like discarded toys. Their airframes crumpled instantly, spilling thousands of pounds of fuel that ignited into a secondary river of fire flowing toward the open hangar bay elevators. The flight deck crew, trained for every possible contingency, were thrown off their feet by a shockwave that cracked the heavy safety glass in the primary flight control tower. Deep within the hull, the damage control central station erupted into a flurry of activity as hundreds of alarms signaled multiple hull breaches. The commanding officer of USS Carl Vinson ordered the ship to general quarters, the bells clanging through every compartment from the reactors to the mess decks. Damage control teams, clad in heavy silver fire retardant suits, scrambled toward the flight deck carrying specialized foam hoses and heavy equipment. The air on the roof was now a choking mix of chemical smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of vaporized armor plate. 12 miles to the west, the destroyer USS Mason and the cruiser USS Lake Erie immediately increased speed to 30 knots to provide cover. Their ANSPY-6 radar systems scanned the sky for any following threats, fearing this was only the opening move of a larger saturation attack. The strike group commander watched from the cruiser's bridge as the pride of the 7th Fleet burned under the morning sun. The black smoke was a stark, ugly scar against the clear blue sky, signaling a shift in the balance of power in the Pacific. Every sailor on every ship in the group knew that the next 10 minutes would determine if the carrier would live or die. Despite the chaos and the heat, the crew of the Vinson moved with the disciplined precision of a well-oiled machine. They dragged injured personnel away from the spreading fire and established a perimeter around the massive hole in the flight deck. The fires were being fed by the ruptured fuel lines of the catapult system, and the temperature on the deck reached over 1,000 degrees. The executive officer took charge of the deck-level response, his voice calm over the radio as he directed the firefighting teams to isolate the fuel valves. They engaged the massive washdown system, thousands of gallons of seawater and foam flooding the deck to combat the growing inferno. Initial reports sent to Indo-Pacific Command indicated that while the flight deck was mission-killed, the nuclear reactors remained stable and the hull was intact. The strike had been a precision hit, designed to disable the carrier's ability to launch or recover aircraft for the duration of the engagement. The cost was already being counted. 14 sailors missing, 22 with severe burns, and a gaping wound in the heart of the ship. As the smoke continued to pour from the flight deck, the crew prepared for the long struggle to save their vessel from the inside out. 6:22 in the morning, the flight deck of USS Carl Vinson. The non-skid coating on the steel deck, designed to provide grip for multi-million-dollar aircraft, was bubbling and liquefying under a heat that exceeded 1,200 degrees. Thick, oily black smoke from burning jet fuel rolled across the deck in heavy waves, driven by a 15-knot wind. created by the carrier's own forward momentum. The air was a toxic soup of vaporized titanium, burnt rubber, and the searing chemical stench of aqueous film-forming foam. Every second, the fire moved closer to the island, the massive command tower that housed the bridge, and the primary flight control center. The damage control teams, known as the Red Shirts, moved into the inferno with a discipline that defied human instinct. Led by a chief petty officer with 20 years of service, the first team of 12 sailors dragged a 2.5-inch fire hose toward the wreckage of the two FA-18 fighter jets. The pressure in the line was so great it took 4 men to steady the nozzle, sending a high-pressure stream of foam and seawater into the heart of the tent, burning fuel. The sound of the water hitting the white-hot metal was a high-pitched scream that could be heard even over the roar of the ship's remaining engines. Beside them, a P-25 firefighting vehicle, a low-profile armored tractor, pushed through the debris, its turret-mounted nozzle carving a path through the flames. Inside the island, the situation was becoming critical as smoke began to infiltrate ventilation systems of primary flight control. The glass of the observation windows was hot to the touch, vibrating with the intensity of the secondary explosions occurring on the deck below. The air boss, responsible for all flight operations, remained at his station even as the visibility outside dropped to less than 10 feet. He was coordinating the movement of the surviving aircraft on the forward part of the ship, ordering the deck crews to push 5 F-35 Bravo fighters as far toward the bow as possible. Every aircraft was a potential bomb, filled with thousands of pounds of fuel and live ordnance that could cook off if the heat continued to rise. At coordinates 18 degrees 41 minutes north, 125 degrees 9 minutes east, the carrier began a slow, agonizing turn to put the wind on the beam. This maneuver was designed to blow the smoke and heat away from the island and over the side of the ship, but it also exposed the vulnerable hangar bay openings to the wind. Below the flight deck, in the hangar bay, hundreds of sailors formed a human chain to move crates of AIM-120 missiles and Mark 82 bombs away from the overhead fire. The steel ceiling above them was beginning to glow a dull, cherry red, a terrifying indicator of the temperature on the roof. The sound of water rushing through the overhead sprinkler system was a constant, heavy drumming that signaled the ship's internal defenses were at their limit. A second firefighting team, arriving from the forward stations, began to tackle the Sikdaveyan fire from the opposite side, flanking the impact zone. They used heavy axes and circular saws to cut through the twisted remains of a shattered deck tractor that was pinning a downed sailor. The rescue was performed under a curtain of cooling water provided by their teammates, the steam rising so thick it blinded the rescuers for seconds at a time. They moved with the frantic energy of men fighting for their home, their boots splashing through a mixture of seawater and unburnt fuel that coated the deck, 6 inches deep. The physical toll was immense, as the heavy protective suits trapped the heat of the fire against the sailors' expected bodies, driving their internal temperatures to dangerous levels. On the bridge, the commanding officer received word that the fires were being contained, but not yet extinguished. The primary threat was now the structural integrity of the flight deck itself, which had been warped by the heat of the hypersonic impact. Repair crews from the ship's engineering department were already prepping specialized steel plates and welding equipment to patch the hole once the fires were out. They knew the carrier was a floating target as long as she was unable to launch her own defensive air cover. The crew worked with the knowledge that the enemy might have more missiles in the air, and every minute spent fighting fire was a minute they were not fighting the war. By 6:45 in the morning, the massive wall of foam had finally suppressed the primary fuel fire around the catapults. The orange glow was replaced by a landscape of charred metal and white chemical suds, looking like a nightmare version of a winter scene. The bridge crew could finally see the horizon again, though the air remained thick with the smell of ruin. The carrier was still alive, her heart beating in the engine rooms far below, but her teeth had been pulled. The struggle to save the ship was transitioning from a battle against fire to a battle against time and the mechanical reality of a crippled giant. 7 in the morning. The tactical waters surrounding the crippled carrier. While the crew of the Vinson fought the fires on the flight deck, the escorts of Carrier Strike Group 1 moved into a tight defensive diamond formation. The cruiser USS Lake Erie took the lead. As the primary air defense commander, her ANSPY-1 radar searching the horizon for the next phase of the enemy's plan. Beside her, the destroyer USS Mason pushed her twin propellers to their limit, the hull vibrating with the force of 50,000 horsepower. As she moved to screen the carrier's vulnerable port quarter, the air between the ships was charged with the invisible energy of high-powered radar beams and the heavy, metallic scent of ozone from the massive electronic arrays. At 7:12 in the morning, the tactical data link flashed a new series of red icons across the screens in the Combat Information Center. A swarm of 45 low-cost suicide drones and 8 subsonic anti-ship cruise missiles had been detected emerging from the coastal clutter of the Philippine coast. They were flying at an altitude of only 30 meters, skimming the wave tops to hide from the carrier's long-range sensors until the last possible moment. The defensive coordinator on the Lake Erie did not hesitate, authorizing the use of the Mark 41 vertical launch system to clear the sky. The deck of the cruiser seemed to breathe fire as the first of 12 Standard Missile 2 interceptors roared into the sky. In a sequence of blinding white flashes, the missiles climbed almost vertically, their solid fuel boosters leaving thick white trails that looked like pillars supporting the morning clouds. Each interceptor was guided by the Aegis Combat System, a complex network of computers and phased array radars that could track hundreds of targets simultaneously. 20 miles out, the first of the enemy drones was shredded by a proximity-fused warhead, the small plastic and carbon fiber frame disintegrating into a cloud of confetti. 2 seconds later, another 3 drones were obliterated by a single salvo, their remains tumbling into the whitecaps of the Pacific. The coordination between the Lake Erie and the Mason was seamless, a digital handshake that allowed the ships to share targeting data in real time across the Cooperative Engagement Capability Network. As the remaining cruise missiles closed the distance to 5 miles, the defensive screen transitioned to the inner layer of protection. The destroyer Mason launched 4 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles from her forward decks, the smaller, more agile weapons twisting through the air at twice the speed of sound. One cruise missile, a 802 variant, managed to evade the first layer of interceptors by performing a high-G terminal maneuver, dipping even closer to the water. The Phalanx close-in weapon system on the Mason's port side immediately came to life, its 20mm Gatling gun firing at a rate of 75 rounds per second. The sound was like a giant piece of canvas being ripped apart, a continuous mechanical scream that vibrated through the steel of the ship and into the boots of every sailor on deck. The stream of tungsten cord bullets sawed through the nose of the incoming missile just 800 meters from the hull. The cruise missile erupted in a brilliant white flash, its engine and warhead detonating simultaneously as it hit the surface of the sea. The blast wave sent a wall of spray 50 feet into the air, soaking the sailors on the Mason's weather decks with salt water and the sharp smell of burnt explosive. By 7:25 in the morning, the radar screens were clear of all immediate threats, the second wave successfully neutralized by the strike group's defensive umbrella. The defensive perimeter had held, providing the Vinson with the precious minutes needed to stabilize her internal systems and care for her wounded. The cost of the engagement was measured in the rapid depletion of the strike group's magazine depth. The Lake Erie had expended 24 interceptors, while the Mason had fired 12, leaving their vertical launch cells 40% empty of their primary air defense weapons. The tactical situation at coordinates 18 degrees, 42 minutes north, 125 degrees, 8 minutes east remained extremely fluid. Logistics ships were already being vectored from Naval Base Guam to provide an underway replenishment of missiles, a dangerous operation in active combat waters. The strike group commander knew the enemy was testing their magazines, trying to bleed the escorts dry before launching a third, more powerful strike. The morning sun was now high, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the smoke still trailing from the charred deck of the Vinson. The sea was running with 3-meter swells, the deep blue water marbled with the white foam of the strike group's wakes as they maintained a speed of 20 knots. Despite the successful defense, there was no celebration on the bridges of the escorts or in the darkened rooms of the Combat Information Center. They remained at modified battle stations, the crews rotating through 15-minute breaks for water and quick meals of pre-packaged rations. The smell of hot electronics and diesel exhaust hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the machines, working at their absolute limits to keep the carrier alive. 7:30 in the morning, deep within the steel belly of the USS Carl Vinson. While the battle raged on the flight deck and in the skies above, the engineering plant remained the beating heart of the carrier, struggling to keep the massive vessel alive. In Damage Control Central, located far below the waterline for maximum protection, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of ozone, recycled air, and the faint, terrifying scent of burning electrical insulation. The master status board, a complex grid of light-emitting diodes and digital displays, was a mosaic of red and amber warnings. The impact of the DF-17 hypersonic missile had severed the primary electrical trunks feeding the aft section of the ship, plunging 5 lower decks into total darkness and cutting power to the number 4 catapult systems. Nuclear reactor number 1 and reactor number 2 remain stable at 65% power, their cooling loops functioning within normal operating parameters. However, the physical shock of the hypersonic impact had triggered an automatic safety shutdown of the secondary steam turbines in the aft machinery room. The engineering officer of the watch, a commander with 15 years of experience in the Navy's nuclear program, directed his team to begin the delicate process of shunting power around the damaged sections. Technicians worked in the cramped, humid spaces of the auxiliary machinery rooms, their flashlights cutting through a persistent haze of steam leaking from a ruptured secondary line. The sound was a constant, deafening hiss that made verbal communication nearly impossible, forcing the sailors to use hand signals and pre-drilled emergency procedures. The heat from the flight deck fire was now conducting through the heavy structural steel I-beams, a phenomenon known to the crew as thermal soak. In the compartments directly beneath the impact zone, the temperature of the bulkheads had risen to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The gray navy paint on the walls was beginning to blister and peel, releasing acrid toxic fumes that triggered the local chemical alarms. Damage control teams used portable electric blowers to force fresh air into the lower decks, but the heavy black smoke from the flight deck was being drawn into the external intakes. The engineers were forced to switch to their self-contained breathing apparatus, the rhythmic, mechanical rasp of their own breathing, the only sound inside their protective masks. At coordinates 18 degrees 42 minutes north, 125 degrees 8 minutes east, the ship faced a new internal threat: stability. The thousands of gallons of firefighting foam and seawater being poured onto the flight deck were draining through the scuppers and into the lower voids, causing the carrier to develop a 3-degree list to starboard. The ballasting officer, positioned at the damage control console, coordinated the movement of thousands of tons of fuel and fresh water between the massive storage tanks in the double hull. He monitored the digital inclinometer with practiced precision, his fingers moving across the touchscreen to activate the high-capacity transfer pumps. Slowly, the deck beneath their feet leveled out as the massive vessel responded to the silent, invisible battle being fought by her technicians. By 8 in the morning, the engineering teams had successfully isolated the damaged aft electrical trunks and established a bypass using the emergency bus ties. Power was restored to the forward radar arrays and the primary weapons systems, allowing the ship's defensive computers to fully reintegrate with the rest of the strike group. The smell of burning insulation began to fade, replaced by the clean, metallic scent of filtered air as the industrial-scale scrubbers came back online. The internal communication systems, which had been flickering and crackling for nearly 2 hours, finally stabilized, allowing the bridge to receive a clear status report from the engineering spaces. The Vinson was still a wounded giant, her flight deck scarred and her aft catapults useless, but her heart was beating strong once more. The professionalism of the engineering department had prevented a localized fire from turning into a ship-wide power failure that would have left the carrier a drifting target. As the turbines began to spin back up to full speed, the vibration of the 4 massive propeller shafts could be felt through the deck plates, a reassuring pulse that told every sailor the ship was still in the fight. The engineering officer of the watch wiped the sweat and grease from his face, looking at the restored green lights on his console, before preparing for the next inevitable wave of the engagement. 8:30 in the morning, the Philippine Sea and the coastal waters of the Luzon Strait. The radar displays on the cruiser, USS Lake Erie, suddenly bloomed with 14 high-speed tracks, each one descending from the upper atmosphere at Mach 6. The strike group was holding position at coordinates 18 degrees 43 minutes north, 125 degrees 7 minutes east, maintaining a speed of 22 knots. The morning sun was a bright, harsh disk in a cloudless sky, and the air smelled of salt spray and the hot, metallic tang of the ship's cooling systems. This was the saturation strike the commanders had feared, a coordinated volley of YJ-21 anti-ship ballistic missiles designed to overwhelm the remaining interceptors.
Weapons free!
The tactical coordinator on the Lake Erie gave the order for weapons free, and the cruiser's deck became a platform of controlled violence. The trigger was squeezed, and a salvo of 8 Standard Missile-6 interceptors shrieked off the vertical launch rails, each one a white column of fire punching backward through the morning haze. The heat blast from the launches washed across the faces of the sailors on the weather decks, the temperature rising 50 degrees in a single second. The smoke rose in a dense, swirling pillar that blotted out the aft section of the ship for 3 full seconds before the wind tore it away. Above them, the sky was instantly marked by the jagged, white-hot trails of the interceptors as they accelerated toward the edge of space. 30 miles away and 40,000 feet up, the first Standard Missile-6 struck an incoming YJ-21 in a direct kinetic collision. The warhead punched clean through the enemy missile's guidance section, detonating with a force that bleached the sky white for 50 miles in every direction. The enemy weapon did not just break. It erupted into a 1,000 fragments of glowing slag that rained down into the Pacific over a 5-mile radius. The secondary explosion of the missile's remaining fuel created a jagged fireball that hung in the air like a second sun before it was shredded by the wind. Below, the surface of the sea was peppered with falling debris, the splashes creating a forest of white plumes that looked like a macabre water show. The remaining enemy missiles did not stop, their onboard computers adjusting for the loss of their lead elements. 1. YJ-21 bypassed the cruiser's outer screen and dove toward the destroyer USS Mason, which was positioned 5 miles off the carrier's port quarter. The destroyer's captain ordered a hard turn to starboard, the hull groaning and the deck tilting at a 20-degree angle. As the ship fought its own momentum, the Mason fired a rolling airframe missile at the very last second, the small weapon twisting through the air with a high-pitched scream. The interceptor clipped the incoming warhead just 500 meters from the ship, causing it to tumble and explode prematurely. The blast wave threw 5 sailors off their feet in the hangar bay and compressed the chests of every man on the bridge, the pressure cracking the heavy safety glass in the bridge windows. Black smoke rose from the wreckage of the warhead as it settled into the sea just yards from the Mason's hull. The burning pieces were still above the water when the radio channels of the strike group went silent for exactly 3 seconds before erupting in a frantic exchange of damage reports. On the Carl Vinson, the crew watched as a final piece of debris, a jagged shard of titanium 6 feet long, slammed into the already scorched flight deck. It buried itself 3 feet deep in the steel, vibrating with a low, metallic hum that could be felt through the soles of every sailor's boots. The immediate threat had passed, but the sky remained a mess of crisscrossing smoke trails and the smell of burnt chemical propellant. The strike group commander, watching from the Lake Erie, realized that his magazine depth was now reaching a critical point. The cruiser had expended nearly half of its primary long-range interceptors in less than 5 minutes of intense combat. the tactical reality was shifting. They could not continue to play a purely defensive game against a shore-based battery with an unknown number of reloads. At coordinates 18 degrees 44 minutes north, 125 degrees 6 minutes east, the strike group began to adjust its formation. The destroyers moved closer to the carrier, their hulls overlapping in a forest of radar masts and weapon mounts, creating a pretentious, unified wall of steel. The air around the ships was now thick with the scent of spent explosives and the heavy, oily smell of the ship's own diesel exhaust. The carrier, Carl Vinson, though still scarred and unable to launch her full air wing, was no longer burning, her damage control teams having won their battle. But the crew knew that the defense was only a temporary measure, a way to buy time while the strategic gears began to turn elsewhere. The battle had transitioned from a desperate struggle for survival into a cold, calculated exchange of high-technology attrition. The Pacific was no longer a highway of commerce, but a battlefield where the cost of every second was measured in millions of dollars and human lives. 9 in the morning, the cavernous hangar deck of USS Carl Vinson. The space that usually housed millions of dollars of high-performance aircraft had been transformed into a massive triage and medical station. Rows of silver-winged FA-18 fighters and F-35 Bravo jets were pushed to the extreme forward and aft edges of the bay to make room for the emergency response. The air in the hangar was a heavy, suffocating mixture of antiseptic, burnt hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, iron smell of blood. Under the dim red glow of the emergency battle lights, the deck was a landscape of organized desperation, where the only sounds were the hiss of oxygen tanks and the rhythmic snap of medical gloves. The ship's medical department, led by 3 surgeons and 64 hospital corpsmen, had been operating without a break for nearly 3 hours. They were managing a mass casualty situation that would have overwhelmed a mid-sized civilian hospital on land. The primary injuries were severe thermal burns caused by the initial Mach 6 impact of the DF-17 missile and the subsequent flash fire of the catapult fuel lines. Patients were categorized by the color of their triage tags: green for the walking wounded, yellow for those needing urgent care, and red for those whose lives hung by a thread. The corpsmen moved between the stretchers with a silent, practiced efficiency, their uniforms stained with the grit of the flight deck and the reality of modern naval warfare. At coordinates 18 degrees 45 minutes north, 125 degrees 5 minutes east, the carrier continued to steam at 20 knots, the hull vibrating beneath the medical team's feet. The medical officers used portable ultrasound machines and high-capacity ventilators powered by the ship's restored auxiliary electrical grid. Because the flight deck was mission-killed and the elevators were jammed by debris, the standard medical evacuation by MH-60 Sierra helicopter was impossible. The wounded could not be flown to the hospital ship or the naval base in Guam. They had to be saved right here, in the middle of a combat zone. The chief surgeon performed a delicate vascular repair on a young petty officer's leg while the ship leaned into a 10-degree turn, his hands remaining steady as the steel world around him shifted. The cost of the engagement was now being tallied with grim precision by the ship's executive officer. 31 personnel were confirmed killed in action, most of them caught in the initial blast zone near the number 4 catapult or in the compartments directly beneath the flight deck. 112 sailors were listed as wounded, with 19 of those in critical condition suffering from high-percentage body burns and smoke inhalation. Despite the numbers, the morale of the crew remained unbroken, a testament to the thousands of hours of damage control and mass casualty drills performed during the workup cycle. Every sailor on the hangar deck knew that their survival depended on the skill of the docks and the structural integrity of the hull protecting them from the sea. The atmosphere was one of quiet, professional grit rather than panic. Off-duty cooks, administrative clerks, and aviation technicians stood in line to donate blood, the walking blood bank protocol activated for the first time in the ship's history. They sat on the deck plates, sleeves rolled up, watching as the life-sustaining fluid was drawn into bags, to be rushed to the surgical teams. The smell of coffee and stale sweat began to mingle with the medical odors as the ship's galley managed to send down crates of water and high-calorie protein bars to the weary responders. The hangar deck was no longer just a garage for jets. It was the sanctuary of the ship, the place where the human cost of the mission was most visible. Outside the thick steel hangar doors, the Pacific remained a dangerous and unforgiving theater. The spray of the 3-meter swells occasionally washed through the seals, bringing a cold, salty reminder of the world beyond the triage stations. The carrier was maintaining its defensive posture within the strike group, her escorts still scanning the skies for the next incoming threat. The crew in the hangar worked with the understanding that they were the last line of defense for their shipmates' lives. They were fighting a war of attrition against shock, infection, and the clock, knowing that every minute saved on the operating table was a victory as significant as any missile interception. By 9:45 in the morning, the first wave of critical surgeries had been completed, and the triage area reached a state of controlled stability. The most severely injured were moved to the ship's permanent sickbay, while the hangar deck remained ready for any further casualties from secondary explosions or follow-up strikes. The commanding officer's voice came over the general announcing system, his tone steady and resolute as he thanked the medical teams for their Herculean efforts. The message was clear. The Vinson had taken a heavy blow, but she was still a sovereign territory of the United States, and her crew was not finished yet. The focus was now shifting from survival to retribution, as the strategic commanders prepared the counterpunch that would signal the end of the enemy's initiative. 10 in the morning. The forward flight deck of USS Carl Vinson. Rear Admiral James Vance, the commander of Carrier Strike Group 1, stood on the bridge wing and looked down at the surviving 40% of his flight deck. The decision was made to transition from a defensive posture to immediate offensive operations. Despite the jagged steel and charred remains cluttering the aft section of the ship, the air above the carrier was a swirling mix of white steam from the catapults and the heavy, blue-tinted exhaust of 14 idling jet engines. The forward catapults, number 1 and number 2, had been declared operational. After a frantic 4-hour inspection by the ship's master chief engineering technician, the first F-35 Bravo fighter jet taxied into position on catapult number 1, its engine a low, predatory growl that vibrated through the steel deck plates. The pilot, a lieutenant commander with over 2,000 hours of flight time, watched the yellow-shirted flight deck director for the final signal to launch. The heat haze shimmering off the deck distorted the horizon, where the escorting destroyers were still scanning the Philippine Sea for any secondary threats. At the signal, the pilot increased the throttle to full afterburner, the roar of the engine becoming a physical wall of sound that shook the entire island structure. The catapult fired, and the 60,000-pound aircraft was accelerated from 0 to 160 knots in less than 3 seconds. The F-35 Bravo cleared the bow, dipping slightly toward the blue water before its flight control computers corrected the pitch and sent it screaming into the sky. Seconds later, a second aircraft, an EA-18 Gulf Growler electronic warfare jet, followed from catapult number 2, its twin engines leaving a pair of white-hot trails in the humid air. This was the beginning of the counterpunch, a coordinated strike package designed to find and neutralize the mobile missile batteries that had launched the DF-17. The air on the deck was thick with the scent of burnt JP-5 fuel and the sharp, metallic tang of the steam escaping from the catapult water brakes. The flight deck crews moved with a sense of urgent purpose, their colored jerseys a bright contrast against the gray, soot-stained, non-skid surface of the deck. At coordinates 18 degrees 46 minutes north, 125 degrees 4 minutes east, the carrier maintained a steady heading of 090 degrees. In 20 minutes was a feat of technical endurance, considering the heavy damage the ship had sustained only hours before. Each FA-18 fighter was loaded, with 4 Mark 82 500-pound precision-guided bombs and 2 AIM-120 missiles for self-defense. The tactical objective was clear: destroy the long-range sensors and the launch vehicles located on the coast of the Luzon Strait before they could reload for a third strike. The strike group commander knew that the best defense for the Vinson was the total destruction of the enemy's ability to reach out and touch the ship. Below the flight deck, the weapon handlers in the magazines worked in the dim light to prepare the next load of ordnance for the returning jets. On hydraulic carts, their movements synchronized by years of training and the high-stakes pressure of real combat. The smell of grease and cold steel filled the magazines, a sharp contrast to the searing heat and chemical suds that still dominated the upper decks. The ship's internal communication system hummed, with the constant chatter of the strike coordinators and the electronic warfare officers on the Lake Erie. They were feeding real-time target data to the climbing jets, painting a digital picture of the enemy's coastal defenses. By 10:45 in the morning, the entire strike package was airborne and heading west at an altitude of 30,000 feet. The carrier, Carl Vinson, looked small and vulnerable from the air, a scarred gray rectangle surrounded by the white wakes of her vigilant escorts. But the launch of her air wing sent a clear message to the sensors watching from across the horizon. The United States Navy was still in the fight. The physical toll on the deck crews was visible in their slumped shoulders and sweat-soaked uniforms, but their eyes remained fixed on the sky, waiting for their birds to return. The engagement was no longer a one-sided missile attack. It had become a high-stakes duel between a wounded giant and a hidden predator. The horizon was clear for the moment, but the tension in the strike group was higher than it had been during the height of the fire. Everyone from the rear admiral to the youngest seaman knew that the next hour would determine the success of the mission and the safety of the ship. The salt spray of the Pacific continued to wash over the bow, cleaning away the soot and debris as the Vinson pushed forward into the wind. The transition from victim to aggressor was complete, and the weight of the war now rested on the shoulders of the pilots heading toward the Philippine coast. 11 in the morning, the high-altitude airspace over the Luzon Strait. An E-2 Charlie Hawkeye was the first to detect the electronic whisper of the enemy's coastal radar system, its massive rotating dome scanning the horizon with surgical precision. The tactical crew inside the aircraft sat in a cramped, windowless cabin illuminated by the blue glow of high-resolution monitors, their headsets filled with the steady hum of data transmission. Outside the pressurized hull, the air at 25,000 feet was a freezing, thin sapphire blue, a sharp contrast to the humid, smoke-choked world of the carrier deck below. The mission now was to find the needle in the haystack. The mobile transporter erector launchers that had fired the DF-17 missiles and were currently hiding under camouflage nets in the rugged coastal terrain. The hunt was a coordinated effort involving national-level intelligence assets and the organic sensors of the carrier strike group. 300 miles above the Earth, a constellation of infrared satellites operated by the National Reconnaissance Office had already flagged the heat signatures of the initial missile launches. This data was downlinked in real time to the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye and then pushed through the Link 16 tactical data link to every cockpit in the strike package. The pilots of the F-35 Bravo jets used their electro-optical targeting systems to scan the coordinates, looking for the telltale signs of heavy tire tracks in the red clay of the northern Philippine coast. At coordinates 18 degrees 50 minutes north, 121 degrees 10 minutes east, the electronic warfare officers on the EA-18 Gulf Growler detected a spike in signal activity. It was the distinctive pulse of an HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery, the primary guardian of the enemy's long-range strike assets. The Growler immediately began a high-powered jamming sequence, flooding the enemy's radar frequencies with white noise to mask the approach of the FA-18 fighters. The scent of ozone from the high-voltage electronics filled the Growler's cockpit, as the aircraft's mission computers worked to triangulate the exact location of the threat. Within seconds, the digital map on the pilot's heads-up display shifted from a vague area of interest to a set of precise 10-digit grid coordinates. The enemy was located in a narrow valley, 3 miles inland from the coast, sheltered by steep limestone cliffs and dense tropical canopy. 4 mobile transporter erector launchers were identified, their long, tapered missile canisters raised and ready to receive the next volley of hypersonic weapons. Beside them, several support vehicles and a mobile command post were tucked under the shadow of the trees, their crews working frantically to complete the reloading process. The tactical commander in the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye relayed the confirmation to Rear Admiral Vance back on the Carl Vinson. his voice a steady, professional monotone over the encrypted satellite channel. The target was acquired, the sensors were locked, and the hammer was ready to fall. The strategic importance of this moment was not lost on the pilots of the strike package. If they failed to destroy these launchers now, the Carl Vinson would face another hypersonic strike within the hour, a blow that the crippled flight deck might not survive. The pilots adjusted their flight paths, descending to 10,000 feet to stay below the primary search beams of the enemy's long-range early warning radars. The air grew thicker and more turbulent as they dropped toward the coastal mountains, the green carpet of the jungle rushing up to meet them. The smell of the cockpit, a mix of bottled oxygen and the dry scent of recycled air, was the only thing connecting them to the quiet world of the flight deck they had left behind. Back on the Carl Vinson, the strike group's intelligence officers monitored the feed from a high-altitude drone, circling over the target area. They watched in near real time as the enemy crews finished securing the missiles and began to move the launchers toward a pre-surveyed firing position. The tension in the carrier's Combat Information Center was a physical weight, the room silent except for the rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of the tactical controllers. They were watching the countdown to the next engagement, knowing that the window for a successful preemptive strike was closing by the second. The Admiral gave the final authorization, his words recorded for the official campaign report. Execute the strike. Neutralize the threat. By 11:40 in the morning, the strike package had reached the weapons release point 20 miles off the coast. The F-35 Bravo jets opened their internal weapons bays, the sleek lines of the aircraft momentarily broken by the deadly cargo hidden within. The target coordinates were fed into the guidance computers of 8 AGM-88 HAR missiles and 12 precision-guided bombs. The hunt was over. The kill was about to begin. The Pacific echoed with the sound of 18 jet engines pushing toward the shoreline, a sound that signaled the end of the enemy's initiative in the Luzon Strait. 11:45 in the morning. The Luzon Strait coast and the vertical launch decks of the cruiser USS Lake Erie. The order to fire was relayed through the satellite link, and 16 Tomahawk cruise missiles began their journey toward the hidden valley, where the enemy launchers were positioned. The trigger was squeezed on the bridge of the cruiser, and the missiles shrieked off the rails in pairs, white columns of fire punching backward through the heavy tropical air. The heat blast from the simultaneous launches washed across the superstructure of the Lake Erie, the temperature rising instantly as the smell of burning chemical propellant filled the ventilation intakes. The smoke rose in a dense, swirling pillar that momentarily blotted out the sun before the wind tore it into long, white ribbons across the Philippine Sea. 12 miles inland, the first Tomahawk cruise missile impacted the lead transporter erector launcher. At over 500 kilometers per hour, the 1,000-pound warhead punched through the reinforced steel of the missile canister and detonated the high volatile hypersonic fuel stored inside. A fireball 300 feet wide erupted instantly, bleaching the green jungle canopy white and sending a shockwave that flattened every tree within a half-mile radius. The sound was a sustained, earth-shaking roar that could be felt by the pilots of the F-35 Bravo fighters circling 5,000 feet above. The lead launcher was not just destroyed. It was vaporized, leaving a charred crater in the red clay where the pride of the enemy's coastal defense had stood seconds before. The enemy ground crews, caught in the open during the reloading process, were thrown through the air like ragdolls by the massive overpressure of the secondary explosions. One HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery attempted to pivot its radar toward the incoming F-35 Bravo fighters, but the electronics were already being shredded by the AGM-88 HAR missiles released moments earlier. The radar dish was torn from its mount by a direct hit, spinning into the limestone cliffs with a sound of screaming, tortured metal. The surviving soldiers scrambled for cover. In the burning undergrowth, their formation shattered and their command structure dissolved into a state of absolute panic. A second HQ-9 launcher attempted to fire a desperation shot, but the missile exploded in the tube, the shrapnel cutting down the entire launch crew in a single white flash. Thick black smoke rose from the cratered remains of the valley, the secondary cooking off of unspent missile motors, creating a series of jagged white flashes. The radio frequency used by the enemy command post went to dead silence for exactly 10 seconds before being replaced by the frantic, overlapping screams of the survivors. The valley was now a landscape of fire and twisted aluminum, the sharp chemical bite of burning solid fuel drifting toward the coast on the afternoon breeze. Above the carnage, the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye confirmed the total destruction of all 4 primary targets, the red icons on the tactical display winking out one by one. The mission was a total success. The enemy's long-range reach in the Luzon Strait severed in a single, surgical stroke of kinetic power. Following the Tomahawk strike, the FA-18 fighters moved in to finish the remaining support vehicles with Mark 82 precision-guided bombs. Each hit was recorded by the jet's high-definition targeting pods, showing the thermal signatures of the enemy fuel trucks erupting into secondary infernos. The tactical commanders on the Carl Vinson watched the live feed with a grim sense of satisfaction, the cost of the morning's attack finally being repaid in full. At coordinates 18 degrees 51 minutes north, 121 degrees 11 minutes east, the enemy's coastal defense infrastructure had ceased to exist. The area was a graveyard of scorched earth and melted steel, the heat so intense that the nearby tropical vegetation continued to ignite spontaneously minutes after the last bomb fell. The strike group's retaliation had been swift and absolute, demonstrating the terrifying efficiency of a coordinated naval and air assault. Initial battle damage assessments indicated that 48 enemy personnel were killed in action, and over $200 million worth of advanced missile hardware was destroyed. The threat of a third hypersonic volley against the carrier had been neutralized, allowing the strike group to finally focus on the recovery and repair of their own wounded. The pilots of the strike package began their turn back toward the east, their fuel levels low, but their mission objectives fully achieved. The air over the Philippine Sea was still filled with the white trails of the morning's battle, but the tactical initiative had shifted back to the United States Navy. As the jets crossed the shoreline, the pilots looked back at the pillar of black, smoke rising from the Luzon Strait coast, a landmark of the shift in the Pacific balance of power. The smell of the cockpit, once filled with the tension of the hunt, now felt like a sanctuary of professional accomplishment. They checked their instruments and prepared for the difficult task of landing on the scarred, shortened flight deck of the Carl Vinson. The carrier was waiting for them, a distant gray silhouette against the vast blue of the Pacific, still smoking but still very much alive. The counterpunch was over, and the long road to recovery and strategic reassessment was about to begin for the crew of the 7th Fleet, 1 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea, 350 miles east of the Luzon Strait. USS Carl Vinson maintained a steady course of 090 degrees at a speed of 15 knots, her bow cutting through the 3-meter swells of the deep Pacific. The immediate fires on the flight deck had been extinguished for over 2 hours, leaving behind a jagged, blackened scar that stretched for 150 feet across the aft landing area. The air around the ship was no longer thick with the acrid smoke of jet fuel, replaced instead by the clean, salt-heavy breeze and the rhythmic sound of waves slapping against the hull. The crew had transitioned from the desperate adrenaline of damage control to the exhausting, methodical work of recovery and assessment. The recovery of the strike package was the most critical operation of the afternoon, as the landing area near the No. 4 catapult was still too hot and structurally unstable for standard flight operations. The air boss, operating from the smoke-stained primary flight control tower, directed the returning F-35 Bravo and FA-18 fighter jets to perform a modified recovery. The forward arresting wires, specifically wires 1 and 2, had been inspected and cleared for use by the ship's boatswain's mates. Each pilot faced a narrow margin of error, landing on a deck that was cluttered with the charred remains of deck tractors, and the silver-suited firefighting teams standing by at the edges of the safety lines. One by one, the 14 aircraft slammed onto the deck, their tailhooks catching the steel cables with a violent, metallic snap that echoed through the entire ship. At coordinates 18 degrees 51 minutes north, 125 degrees 3 minutes east, the carrier strike group began to consolidate its formation for the long transit to the east. The cruiser USS Lake Erie and the destroyer USS Mason moved into flanking positions, their radar arrays still active and searching for any sign of a follow-up threat. Underway replenishment preparations were already underway, as the strike group would need to take on thousands of gallons of fuel and fresh provisions before reaching the safety of deep water. The logistics ship USNS Cesar Chavez was vectored to meet the group at 18 degrees north, 129 degrees east, bringing with it the specialized repair parts needed to stabilize the Vinson's warped flight deck plates. The final campaign report for the engagement, drafted by the strike group intelligence officers, detailed the high cost of the 6-hour battle. The United States Navy confirmed 31 personnel killed in action and 112 wounded, many of whom remained in critical condition in the ship's intensive care unit. 5 FA, 18 fighter jets, and 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were destroyed or rendered beyond repair by the initial hypersonic impact and subsequent fires. The structural damage to the USS Carl Vinson was significant, including a 6-foot hole in the flight deck and extensive thermal warping of the primary support girders in the aft galleries. The cost in hardware was estimated at over $400 million, not including the long-term shipyard time required for full restoration. However, the strategic results of the counterstrike were equally decisive and formed the core of the Admiral's briefing to Indo-Pacific Command. The enemy's coastal missile infrastructure in the northern Philippines had been effectively neutralized, with 4 DF-17 transporter erector launchers confirmed destroyed, 2 HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries, and 1 mobile command post were also obliterated by the combination of Tomahawk cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs. The strike group had successfully demonstrated that even a wounded carrier could project power and eliminate high-tier threats across hundreds of miles of contested territory. The tactical initiative in the Luzon Strait had been reclaimed, and the enemy's ability to launch a follow-up hypersonic saturation attack was gone. The atmosphere on the ship as the sun began to dip toward the horizon was one of somber, professional resolve. The mess decks were filled with tired sailors, their faces smeared with soot and grease, eating their first hot meal in over 10 hours in a state of near-total silence. There were no cheers or celebrations. The reality of their lost shipmates weighed heavily on every compartment from the engine rooms to the bridge. The ship's chaplain led a brief, whispered prayer over the general announcing system for those who had been lost, the words drifting through the hallways, where the smell of burnt metal still lingered. The Vinson was a scarred and battered vessel, but her flag was still flying, and her engines were pushing her toward the horizon with the steady strength of a survivor. By 4 in the afternoon, the carrier strike group had increased speed to 20 knots, leaving the Philippine Sea behind as they headed toward Naval Base Guam. The transit would take 3 days, during which the crew would work around the clock to weld temporary steel patches over the flight deck and continue the triage of the wounded. The incident would be analyzed for years by naval strategists, a case study in the lethality of hypersonic weapons and the incredible resilience of the American sailor. As the stars began to appear over the dark waters of the Pacific, the USS Carl Vinson moved through the night as a testament to the endurance of the United States Navy. The battle was over, the mission was accomplished, and the long process of healing and rebuilding was just beginning.